If there's one thing that's been a persistent criticism of Miraculous Ladybug right from the very beginning of me getting into the show, it's been the quality of the writing. This has been a somewhat eternal issue for the fandom and manifests in various different ways across the different seasons. There's been complaints about the character and plot development that was moving too slowly. Complaints that Adrien/Cat Noir was being sidelined as an important character increasingly in favour of Marinette, who was quickly being presented as the main character, bar none. Complaints that Chloe had an aborted redemption arc where it felt like she was going to be presented as more of an anti-hero than anything else. Annoyance that Marinette wouldn't give Cat Noir a chance. Annoyance that the alternate ships crashed out too early and everything reverted to the status quo. The way they wrapped up Chloe's arc in Season 5. The way they wrapped up the first saga in the show in Season 5. Lots of hate and lots of rage to be had. I certainly had a lot of my own complaints along the way. My videos can attest to that. By the end of Season 5, I was thinking the writing was pretty much cooked. There was no way to salvage things going forward. Then they released a really good special and suddenly my mind was open to the possibility. Could Season 6 actually be good? For the most part, that answer's been yes. I think this season has been tremendous in terms of its writing and has managed to craft a lot of really compelling episodes. It does feel somewhat like a page has been turned in the quality of the overall narrative, but that being said, it could also be a bit of a premature statement. Regardless, that doesn't mean that the season's been perfect or anything of the sort, and as always, there have been some complaints. One of the more notable ones that even I shared and made a video on was that Marinette's character was still a bit off and felt like it would regress in certain episodes. She's better than she was, but it does feel like they forcefully prevent her from growing past certain character beats that no longer fit or make sense within the wider context of the character. As I said though, that's not really what we're talking about today. Nope. Today I want to talk about another complaint that I've been hearing quite a lot of. I'm not saying it's some universal critique or anything of the sort, but it does feel like something I've been seeing cropping up in comments and posts and whatnot to the point that it had me wanting to dive in and give my own thoughts. And that is that in Season 6 and the show in general, they're glorifying the idea of parental redemption and giving forgiveness and grace to shitty or abusive parents. I will admit that there is a lot to draw on when we're talking about this, so for starters, we should go through the list and try to shine a light on what people are talking about. We'll start with the first one to get his redemption. We're talking Jagged Stone. During the course of Season 4, we learn that this dude is a severe deadbeat. Loaded as hell, the dude ditched out on his family to live the life of a rock and roll star, never bothering to meet or introduce himself to his own children. Severe neglect. Not like he didn't know who they were or anything, he just didn't seem to care until his mistakes came back to haunt him when Luca got akumatized at the start of Season 4. From then on though, it was a pretty easy pathway for the dude to get back in the good graces of his kids, and then he's off on a world tour with his girlfriend/manager and his son. There you go. Then there's Andre Bourgeois, who across the span of the show's run was a pretty terrible parent. He obviously loved his daughter, but he was utterly lacking in conviction despite being her primary carer, and allowed her to turn into a miniature version of his terrible wife. However, the show then throws a bit of a curveball and has him bond with his stepdaughter Zoe, which culminates with him pretty much disowning Chloe, taking in Zoe as his new daughter, and the story framing this as the right thing to do. Gabriel had his whole ending to Season 5 where he tells Ladybug to ensure that Adrien remembers him fondly and as a hero. He even gets a statue built to commemorate his life and sacrifice. Then there's Natalie, who is pretty much a parent to Adrien at that point too. She was party to the abuse and helped Gabe at every turn, until it seemed like she was personally affected, which made her have a change of heart and turned her against Gabe for good. She gets revived by Gabe's wish, convinced by Ladybug to tell nobody, and avoids all consequences whilst picking up the slack as Adrien's new adopted mum. Hell, all of that's just from pre-Season 6, and already a couple of those arcs were deeply unpopular. Within Season 6 though, we've seen a few more crop up, and I wouldn't be shocked for them to keep on coming. In Sublimation we had the super aggressive mum who puts massive pressure on Sublime, and shit talks her ex-husband and calls him weak every chance she gets, simply because he tries to be kind and supportive to their daughter. At the end of the episode she apologizes, and just like that it seems to be all over. We have Ivan and his ex-con father who, despite getting a second chance, hasn't changed as a person. He wants Ivan to follow him into a life of crime by helping him steal the Mona Lisa. When Ivan refuses, this dude goes crazy and rants about how Ivan's grandma, who raised him by the way, turned him into a weakling, etc, etc. Even after he's de-akumatized, he tries to shit-talk him and is shut down by Ivan in hero form. The ending sort of implying that he might be on the path to proper redemption at some point. Nathaniel's parents, who are not explicitly homophobic outright, but who are clearly presented that way if you have any sort of media literacy whatsoever and can read between the lines. They get shamed by Ladybug and they change their tune and become accepting. Forgive me if I've missed any others, but that's what we've got so far. Oh wait, we can also cram the grandparents of Adrien in there, specifically the rich aristocratic Graham family. Lord Graham was openly classist and elitist when he was talking to people he perceived as his social inferiors, i.e. the Grossettes, and felt very abuse-coded to me in the way he spoke to his wife, but then at the end it's all good, let's go eat chips. Now, let's take a step back and have a breath, because I can already feel some of your blood pressures beginning to rise, and hear the click-clack of furious typing about how this is truly terrible writing. For those that are not in the know of what this main critique actually is, I will explain now. A lot of these parents, grandparents, or guardians well and truly suck as people. They're trash, absolute trash, and they treat the child they're supposed to love like shit. However, by the end of their storyline, no matter what they did or how bad they've behaved, there's some measure of forgiveness by the character they've wronged, usually their own child, or by the narrative itself, giving you a nice, soft, and woobified moment to end the episode on a high point. I've seen a lot of anger out there that this sort of writing encourages forgiveness for abusive parents and lazily wraps up arcs. In essence, there's this idea that bad people rapidly changing and getting rapid forgiveness from their victim, or from the narrative itself, is bad. I will say in broad strokes I agree with this sentiment, but I'm not sure you can apply it in every single direction and with every single character here. Is this type of writing present in the show? Probably, to be honest, but I don't think it's as clear-cut as you'd expect, and a lot of these storylines well and truly need time to breathe and gestate, for lack of a better word. I guess we can start by taking a look at Gabe, because he's probably the biggest name on the list. This is the one that I really don't think a single person should be criticizing right now. If you think that Gabe managing to get Marinette to tell the world he was a good person who did the right thing was an exercise in absolving abuse, then you lack media literacy. I'm not trying to be mean, but it is the truth. No kitty gloves this time. I think it's very obvious, even back at the end of Season 5, before we got anything else, that this was always set to blow up in everybody's face. Adrian was going to go along thinking his dad was actually a great guy, and they learn at some stage that nope, he actually sucks ass. And this would be a massive blow to him, and lead to a lot of personal trauma. I mean, already he has a pretty compelling storyline in regards to Gabe that's churning along in the background of the season if you look what he says in various episodes. There's the whole debacle with the letter, and then his thoughts about the toy frog and the things his dad hid from him, i.e. his grandparents. There's more emphasis on how it was Natalie that stepped up to parent him when Emily was sick and Gabe just ignored him. There's the fact that he had no passions of his own because his dad controlled his life. All of this is meant to create inner turmoil, and I reckon suspicion eventually about the version of events he's been told. Because whilst he has these early memories of his dad, and he's been told his dad redeemed himself and the world thinks he's a hero, past a certain point, his dad was sour and cold. By the time's all said and done, I don't think there's going to be a Gabe redemption. I don't think the narrative's trying to sell us on that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had that letter, because now he's still being framed negatively despite his change of heart. He's the parent who couldn't change, not until the last seconds of his life, and a deathbed repentance means very little if you ask me. As sort of a double act from this, we have Natalie, who occupies a very strange position in the narrative. I feel like the writing does actually sort of brush under the rug. She was very much part of the abuse of this boy. Instead, it frames her as feeling guilty for not being stronger, has her have some sort of imposter syndrome about not being his real parent. She also tries to take responsibility for her crimes at the end of the first saga, but Ladybug doesn't want that because she wants to cover it all up for Adrian's sake. And that's all well and good. It shows the narrative thinks she probably should have accountability, but once again, I think it's because she's been positioned as a supervillain, and that's what they consider to be bad, not the whole helping in the emotional abuse of your surrogate son thing. So in that regard, it does feel like the narrative downplays it. Nobody recognizes her role in this. Maybe that will come up if they further play into this Illuminati style sort of thing, but even then, I'm not so sure they will. I do think there's going to be some sort of narrative reckoning for Natalie. This isn't the end. But at the same time, I think she is going to be earning some sort of redemption, but perhaps not at the last minute. I think she's going to serve as the reflection of Gabe, who couldn't change until it was too late and thus tarnish his memory in the eyes of his son, but meanwhile they'll have her actually earn her forgiveness right in front of Adrian's eyes. And clearly there's going to be a lot more to her story. So for Natalie, I'd say I'm on the fence. On one hand, it does brush under the rug a lot of the things she's done, but I don't think the narrative's overtly pushing the toxic forgiveness mentality or avoiding consequences for being a bad parent. I think it's just a bit sloppily written. Conversely though, I do think that Jagged Stone is a premium example of this mentality. Dude is mostly a comedy side character, but the reality is, he was a deadbeat dad for like 16 years until he was forced by his akumatized son to reveal the truth. And then, and only then, did he bother to make time for his kids. However, beyond a few jokes and whatnot, it 100% gets brushed over, with both of his kids just being excited to have a dad for once, even if Juleka was nervous at first. I mean, I suppose the show does present Luca as perhaps the nicest, most forgiving guy of all time. But there is very minimal introspection from Jagged, other than some throwaway lines and him taking Luca around the world to protect him from Monarch. To be honest, it's rather janky writing from my perspective. Same with Andre. It's a similar concept. Dude did the wrong thing for seasons upon seasons upon seasons and was one of Chloe's abusers. Enabling to the extent that he did it is still abuse, no matter what way you want to slice it. Thus, for him to ditch out on his kid that he was the main carer for, and who he allowed to become as awful as she did, and then be framed as the hero of the narrative for those actions? For the story to actively tell us that what he did was the right thing? No, that's off. That being said, is it completely off the table they go back to try to right some of these wrongs? I wouldn't say that. A lot of these episodes during the course of Season 6 have been exploring these side characters and their own subplots, and so good chance Luca gets one of his own, and Julika could get a lot more focus too. That would be a good chance to properly address this sort of thing in a more serious way, and actually have Jagged properly atone to his kids. Same with Andre. I think with this story with Zoe, it could actually drag Andre in and give his own character a chance to have some sort of narrative reflection about how he wronged Chloe, especially if Zoe's storyline revolves around her being a bad person to try to fit in with the crowd. It's a reflection of how he was a bad person to fit in with Audrey. It could make for an interesting dynamic. We'll have to wait and see. Ultimately though, I think those are more window dressing examples of the type of writing people are talking about. Some of it's old bungled storyline from Season 5, others are clearly setups for further angst and drama. But what about the cases from Season 6 that I think inspired the discourse I base this video around? Sublime's mum, Nathaniel's parents, Ivan's dad. All clearly abusive in their own way, but all who seem to have a closer understanding with their child by the end of the episode. That's what's made people think that this season is promoting a form of toxic forgiveness, where young viewers may be encouraged to simply forgive and forget shitty actions if they get a simple apology, no matter what the circumstances were. That being said, I think people are being somewhat misguided when it comes to this type of complaint. I don't think that's what the show's doing at all in these instances. In the context of Ivan's dad, the episode openly acknowledges that he sucks. He's a criminal, he wants Ivan to follow in his footsteps and considers him a weakling for not doing so. Ivan was raised by his grandma, and he wants to avoid the same pitfalls as his parents, who seem to both be criminals. He wants to think that his dad's going to change, but realizes it's actually not going to happen when he's approached about becoming a career criminal himself. It causes a bit of a breakdown for him, and eventually he has to confront his dad and takes him down alongside the heroes. He then openly shit-talks his dad and calls him the weak one. He doesn't step in when the cops are going to arrest him. That's Ladybug and Cat Noir that do that. There's no scene with the two of them where he says he forgives his dad. And later on he tells his friends that he knows his dad sucks, but it felt good to face the truth about it at last. For me, that's not forgiveness. It's an openness to his dad potentially trying to change, whilst acknowledging all of his flaws and their difficult relationship. For me, if they ever follow up on this storyline again, which they might not to be honest, then I think the dynamic between father and son will be distant and distrusting, at least on Ivan's behalf. That was my takeaway from the episode. For Sublime's mum and Nathaniel's parents, yeah, I get it, they suck. Sublime's mum is openly cruel to Sublime's dad and puts insane pressure on her daughter to be the best, making her feel crushed under everything. When her ex is kind to their kid, she considers that to be soft, to be coddling. She does have that change of heart after she's akumatized, but even then, it feels like her first thoughts were about finding a sponsor afterwards, which leads them right to Tomoe. Does Sublime even like competing as a runner? Is that ever really addressed? Or is this an Adrian situation where it's been forced on her, and so while she likes doing it, it's not her true passion? Either way, I just don't see this being the end for her character being terrible. It's the same with Nathaniel's parents. The mum's a crazy control freak who openly hates on her son's life choices in very cruel ways, and the dad is at best an enabler, and at worst homophobic, judging by his original comments on the comic. What is it that makes these people change? It's getting shamed by Ladybug publicly. That is legitimately it. That is the trend with these parents. When things affect them specifically in a negative way, it makes them briefly change to act nice, briefly have a positive ending, and then it's right back to the same old shit. I know it may feel as if the episode promotes a toxic form of forgiveness based on the subject matter, but I honestly don't know if that's going to end up being the case. Think about all the times it felt like Gabe and Adrian would have a positive moment, where it feels as if Gabe had had a change of heart, and then it's right back to the status quo the very next episode. Happened a few times with Kagami and Tomoe as well. I suspect there's going to be more to these dynamics that meet the eye, and much like Gabe, they'll demonstrate that a moment of compassion doesn't mean the same thing as truly changing and becoming better. I just think it adds depth to them, that bad people can still be nice. I mean, I could be wrong, but I suspect that's how it's going to go. Both sets of parents seem off, and at the very least, I think Nathaniel's mum is one of those secret council members. Plus, now Sublime's story's getting tied up with Tomoe. Yeah, it's not the end. We just have to let it play out. Hence why I think people getting too up in arms about this, only 7 or 8 episodes in, is just jumping the gun somewhat. If I'm wrong, I will own up, but based on how things are playing out so far, I don't think I am. Regardless, with all that being said, these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think about all of this? Do you agree that for the most part this critique doesn't hold water? Or am I completely off base with everything I've said? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.